All right, and welcome back. So right now we're going to continue our conversation on the formative or pre-classic period with discussion of the Zapotec and the Teotihuacan. So when we start talking about the Zapotec, we're really talking about one site in the Teotihuacan Valley, Monte Alban. Monte Alban is an interesting place because it seems to have an independent development. That means there's connections to the Olmec and the Veracruz coast. It seems like they're getting influenced by them, but it doesn't seem that they are the same people. They seem to be a separate group of people. And they also have a much longer time period. Their early phase is pretty much simultaneous to the last phase of the Olmec. So the Olmec are pretty much done by the time we hit the Classic period. And that's when Monte Alban and the Zapotec are really getting going. But they also have a long middle phase. And so they have this long period of development, and they have actually a very, very long tail end into the late phase, which is analogous to the Classic period. So they are a pre-classic, classic culture, and many of the structures we're going to be looking at are laid down in the Classic period, but they are laid down right on top of the pre-classic monuments. Remember, every Mesoamerican monument is like a Russian doll. You never tear down a pyramid, you just build another pyramid on top of it, and they all get encased inside of each other. So when we look at the ceremonial center, even though what we're seeing here is probably Classic period stuff from 600 to 900, it shows some influence coming from the Classic Maya. The fabric of this urban center is really laid down in the early Classic period. So what's interesting is that it has many of the features that we've come to associate with the Olmec and other periods. We have these large platforms. The earliest platforms seem to be a large, earthen mounds that then get formalized into stone platforms. Some of the things I want to call to your attention are, of course, in this case, the ballcourt. This is one of the earliest iterations of a ballcourt that we know. Again, this is a later ballcourt, but probably built on the previous ballcourt. Notice also we have that same arrangement of one large central platform flanked by side platforms. We also have that kind of E arrangement in many of the structures. Some of the things we're going to take a look at, we'll take a look at the ballcourt, some of the other structures, and we'll over here look at the Plaza of the Dancers, which are probably not dancers. They're probably either sacrificial victims or ball players, or possibly both. So here's a view of it. It really is an amazing complex. Here you can see the larger platforms. As you can see, these are formalized. If you look at the steps here, you notice there's a break in the steps. That's because when this was excavated, this is the steps from the later period. It's always important to know that when we look at these pyramids, we're never quite looking at the last phase, or very rarely. So when a city goes down and people abandon it, or it gets conquered and people no longer are maintaining the building, the last phase is the stuff that's exposed to nature and the elements, and it's the part that's going to be eroded and collapsed. Interestingly enough, this means that the inner pyramids are sometimes better preserved than the outer layer. And when you restore these things, it's a question: do you restore the outer layer, where you don't have much evidence, or do you restore the inner layer, which is much better preserved? Here is the south platform, and you can see that, again, we have a large platform, and there would have been a temple on top of this, and we have the lower part of the temple, but the upper building is now missing. So we have centralized worship. The ball court is perhaps one of the more interesting. It has the classic eye-shaped design. It's not a terribly large ball court. Now, these aren't bleachers. Everybody thinks that. Everybody thinks these are like bleacher seats where people sit. This is actually part of the court. People are going to be watching the game either on the end here or on top of these. These are actually playing surfaces. The ball game happens inside here, and these are places that you can bounce the ball off of. We'll talk more about that in a bit. So the fact that there's a ball court here shows that it has strong connections probably to Mayan centers and cultures. Ball courts are pretty ubiquitous in the Mayan sphere, and they actually get less common the further north you go. So there's not a lot of ball courts in the Toltec and Aztec sphere. There's a few. The one area that's been excavated that has significant sculpture are going to be these danzantes, these dancing figures. The figures are carved onto monoliths. There's a great number of them. Oftentimes they are naked. They appear to be nude. They have glyphs identifying them. But again, these are not very easily translated. The interpretation of these is very, very difficult. They are kind of very lively, very organic. In that case, people suggest this shows the Mayan influence. They might be ball players, or they might in fact be sacrificial victims. We have other objects that come, including a lot of ceramic wares. One of the ones that's most interesting is Tlaloc. Whenever you see this guy with these goggle-like eyes, this is almost certainly a representation of Tlaloc. Tlaloc is a rain god and a war god of Teotihuacan, and so this shows that here in the southern reaches of Mexico, they're still being influenced by these cultures to the north. But something about the organic quality of some of their sculpture, particularly the dancing figures, but also in the ceramics, suggests maybe a connection to the Olmec or to the Maya. So that brings us to Teotihuacan. Teotihuacan is one of the more impressive and striking locations in all of Mexico. It is located here, just to kind of the north and the east of what is modern-day Mexico City, in the Valley of Mexico. Tenochtitlan is where the city of the Aztecs were. That's where Mexico City was built. And it is just to the north of that. It was known as the place or the city of the gods, and that was a name that was given to it by the Aztecs. The Aztecs regarded it as a sacred site. We honestly don't know what they called it themselves, so we're going to have to call it Teotihuacan. Teotihuacan is this period here, so it actually postdates the Zapotec period, but overlaps the later phase of the Zapotec and Monte Alban and the foundation of that, and actually goes into the Classic period. So it is a late formative, early Classic civilization. The high points are going to be around 200 BCE to 400 BCE, but I think the latest evidence says that people were living there as late as 750 CE. That's well into the Classic period. But pretty much after 400 CE, it goes into a period of decline and then is ultimately abandoned. It is one of the few genuine urban centers that exists. When we talk about Mesoamerican civilizations, they don't have a lot of urban centers. There is a kind of decentralized population. The centers are for elites, for marketplaces, and most importantly, religious sites, temples. And you can think of these as places where people from the outlying villages come in to celebrate and worship and trade, but then they go back and move to their villages. It's surprising how these urban centers don't have much of an urban population, at least in the Mayan and Monte Alban and etc. The population is spread out to the hinterlands. But doesn't seem to be the case of Teotihuacan. Teotihuacan appears to be an actual, genuine city, laid out on a grid. It has many, many different structures. I mean, you can see how many different structures. We call these palaces, but they're probably villas or houses of individual powerful families that come along. The city has some of the most stark and most beautiful views. There are two main monuments. Of course, this is the Pyramid of the Moon on this side, and then the larger Pyramid of the Sun, which is perpendicular to the main axis. The main axis being what's known as the Avenue of the Dead. And then we have a plaza here with many smaller pyramids, and then we have the Temple of the Sun right here. Really, truly gargantuan. And very, very difficult to kind of get a handle on in terms of its creation and its importance and and significance to the region. This might be the only Mesoamerican state that truly could be called an empire. It seems to exhibit an enormous amount of influence, and not just culturally, although there's plenty of that. The one kind of identifying hallmark artifact of Teotihuacan is the tripod vessel. You have these vessels that have either incised or polychromed exteriors, and they have three very characteristic feet. And you will find tripod vessels exactly like that all the way down in the Mayan sphere and the Yucatan. And so trade objects, actual Teotihuacan objects, will show up in Mayan tombs. And we know this because you can actually test the clay. The clay has a chemical signature. You can actually look at it in a microscope and observe the structure, and it's very, very characteristic. And so you can tell whether the clay came from the Mexico Basin Valley or whether it came from the Yucatan, and clearly there are Teotihuacan objects buried in Mayan tombs. But the Mayan are also making their own copies of Teotihuacan objects. So this suggests not just that there's trade, but there's a great deal of cultural influence. But there may be more than just that. Teotihuacan seems to be the only place that can expand its power beyond the base of its city. And we know this because there are a number of inscriptions in the Mayan sphere that hint at the power of Teotihuacan. The most important is Stela 31. Now this comes from Tikal. We'll talk more about this when we get down there to Tikal. But this is an ascension monument, so it commemorates the ascension of Siwaj Chongquil II, or Stormy Sky. And he comes to power, but on the back of this stele, he has a very, very long inscription that pretty much gives his genealogy, and he descends from a character that is known as Siwa Kaak, or Siwaj Kawak. And Siwaj Kawak is a name that was identified by a glyph, and the glyph looks like a burning or smoking frog. And so for the longest time, we called this character Smoking Frog, which is like the coolest name ever. We now think that his name literally means born in fire. So that's been reinterpreted. And this character is actually known from a few monuments. And it's kind of curious because he seems to be not a native to the area. He seems to be a general, and he is being sent to this area by another character with a fantastic name known as Spearthrower Owl. So if you're, hey, if you're in Utah, Utah's known for its crazy baby names. If you've got any inkling, name a kid Spearthrower Owl or Smoking Frog. I'll give you immediate, 10% extra credit if you do. It's Utah. I shouldn't say that. People will do that. Yes, this is my son, Spearthrower Owl Smith, and this is my son, Smoking Frog Johnson. Okay. Anyhow, so Smoking Frog, or Born in Fire, however you want to call him, seems to be a general from the ruler of Teotihuacan. And in fact, on this stele, there is a representation on a shield of Tlaloc, Tlaloc being the national deity to Teotihuacan, and a deity that's not really known in the Mayan sphere. And it appears he pops up, and he's not a king. He's not a ruler. He's not a noble. And there are other nobles there that are the Ahau, or the rulers. That's the title. Ahau is the name of a ruler in the Mayan sphere. And Smoking Frog shows up, and he seems like he's there to check on people, and then within short order, he's in charge. And the noble families that were mentioned before are just gone. Their record has just kind of been erased. So it seems like Teotihuacan had the power to put people on the throne of these very remote provinces. And so, starting at Copan and then El Peru and Tikal, these areas fall, and the people who take over claim lineage from people who actually come from Teotihuacan. It's really fascinating. So Teotihuacan itself is probably a city of, estimates are around 50 to 100,000. That's a massive urban center, much bigger than anything else we see in the Mesoamerican world. You gotta go to South America to see populations on that size. So it may be the only true empire of this age, but we're dealing with very fragmentary evidence, and ironically, while the Mayans have a complete writing system, Teotihuacan doesn't seem to. They have individual glyphs, place name glyphs, and proper names, but not much more than that. And so we don't have any writings from Teotihuacan itself that will allow us to reconstruct its history. We have to do it with these other little tidbits that we're, gleaning from records down in the Mayan zone. It's also important to note that this site has been heavily restored. This is, I think, the third largest pyramid in the world by mass. It's shorter than the Pyramid of the Sun is shorter than, say, the Great Pyramids of Giza, but it's got a much wider base, and so it has a great deal of mass. The largest pyramid in the world is the one at Cholula, which is just a massive, massive pyramid. And so the largest pyramid in the world and the third largest pyramid in the world are in Mexico. It's really kind of incredible. And so this was a place that was known, again, by the Aztecs. People knew about it. The ruins were well documented, but they were, of course, ruins, and they were not actually pretty much excavated. This is a picture of what it looked like, and here you can see a painting by Jose Maria Velasco, a Mexican Impressionist landscape painter, and you can see that everything that we see today was just covered with vegetation or with earth. So Leopoldo Batres was commissioned to restore the Pyramid of the Sun. Again, Mexico is very proud of its heritage, and they wanted to do this for the 100-year anniversary of the independence of Mexico. So it happens around 1910. And again, this causes problems because we have evidence that there were 5 tiers to this, or excuse me, 6 tiers to this structure, but this is what ended up getting restored. And as you can tell, looking at this and also looking at some of these earlier photos, it's a bit more pointy at the top than in its current iteration. So remember, again, this is one pyramid built after the other, right on top of each other. So the last layer of the pyramid is going to be the most damaged. If you're an archaeologist, again, you have to make the difficult choice. What do you restore? Do you restore to the better preserved pyramid inside, which is the second to last iteration of the pyramid, or do you restore to the outside where you may not have much evidence and it's not as accurate? So there has been some change to the structure. And unfortunately, this means that a large chunk of this top is missing. It was once taller than it is now. And a lot of this has been formalized to, kind of give it a restored shape and to make it presentable, to make it into a kind of monument that it is today. The same thing happened when Manuel Gamio came through in 1918 and began the restorations of the area known as the Citadel and the Temple of Quetzalcoatl. He had, again, a very eroded pyramid with lots of rubble and not much to work with. But underneath that, on one side, they had built and expanded a platform, and he found these beautiful relief sculptures. And so he excavated all the rubble and got away with that and managed to, show this. Because again, the better preserved, the more spectacular finds are underneath. Now, this isn't, for the day, we wouldn't do this today, but for the day, that was pretty standard archaeological practice. And if you go to the site today, it, of course, looks pristine. But a lot of the stonework you're looking at here is modern. I just want people to be aware of that. A lot of this is restoration work. And it's restoration work done in rubble work and modern concrete. And pretty much has only looked like this since the 20th century, 1910, 1918. And, what can you say about it? You can make a case for this in many ways. For one, if you have a monument like this, Mexico is very much about preserving its past, but also making its past accessible. And so when Mexico typically finds a great monument, they will restore it so that it is stabilized. Covering these in concrete is not entirely bad. That pretty much protects them and makes sure that anything that's inside isn't going to get eroded. And it seals up the, kind of earlier stuff. So if you do need to break this open and go in there and do some excavations, you can. It's a lot harder, but you can do it. So it kind of stabilizes the surface. It also makes it accessible to tourists. Tourists can come here and there's nothing they're going to hurt because they're walking around on modern masonry. And that serves both purposes. The tourism generates dollars, those dollars, or pesos, and those dollars and can then be used to further preserve the site and fund greater excavation. So there's a lot of pros to doing it this way, but there's also a lot of cons, because when you restore something like this, if you're not very, very careful, you can also obliterate a lot of information you didn't intend to preserve. And clearly, we lost a lot of information in this. Again, from the standards of the time, they did a very good job. We would do a more careful job. And it's interesting. All of these sites, countries have different philosophies on what the main goals of the sites are. So down in Guatemala, for example, if they find an archaeological site, they will go do very targeted archaeological expeditions. They will send in professionals to do it, and then they will not develop the site. They will not do anything. I mean, Tikal is developed because it's a very big tourist site, but most of the sites in Guatemala are still ruins in the middle of the jungle and are very, very hard to access unless you're a professional or you have permission from the government to do it. They want to make sure they preserve as much archaeological information as possible, and they have a very hands-off approach, and they don't want to develop them, because if they develop them, then that could cause tourists and other people to damage the site. Mexico has a different philosophy. Mexico wants to develop these as part of their national heritage. You know, you can make the case. I hate to break it to you, but a lot of monuments in Western art, I mean, most of the facade of the Notre Dame was redone in the 19th century by Villaduc. So it's not like we don't do this too. They're currently working on a restoration of the Parthenon, and a large chunk of that, when it's done, is going to be modern as well. You try to do the best you can, at any rate. So let's talk about this. We're going to talk about 3 major monuments on the Avenue of the Dead, and then we're also going to take a look at some of the individual palaces that exist. So we're going to take a look, of course, at the Pyramid of the Moon, the Pyramid of the Sun, and what's known as the Citadel, or the Temple of Quetzalcoatl, sometimes known as the Temple of the Feathered Serpent. Everything is laid out on this axis, and everything is laid out on this grid. And the belief is that the Pyramid of the Sun, again, we don't know that it was the Pyramid of the Sun. We don't know what they called these things. These are all just kind of modern names created. The only one that probably is the Temple to Quetzalcoatl, or the Feathered Serpent, is this one here. There's good reasons to believe that. But it makes sense because the whole city seems to be laid out in a cosmological way to, represent the movements of the major astronomical phenomenon through the heavens. Let's take a look at the Citadel. So the Citadel itself, again, follows this pattern. Large platform, large areas for performances and processions, with 2 adjacent platforms that come out on a sunken courtyard. We have a lower platform on this side with several smaller temples and shrines. We have buildings that almost certainly served the priests and priestesses and officiaries that were here. And then this is the current temple that's been excavated, but you have to remember that this was once covered by a larger temple. And then there was a platform that was created out in front of it that was expanded. So you can see that here. This is the backside of a very eroded temple, and that was badly damaged. But since this platform was built up against the temple, it preserved a layer, and that was the layer that was excavated by Gamio. We also have some other platforms here. This is actually covering a modern excavation that is still ongoing. There's a modern excavation here that started in 2003. They discovered lots of exciting stuff. So this is what it looks like as you come into this massive courtyard. And a lot of this is restored, but, pretty accurately restored. And this is a good place to talk about the nature of this architecture. So when we look at this view, say, for example, from in front of the Pyramid of the Moon, you can see that we have horizontal bands in the architecture, and then we have a kind of sloping wall that joins them. And this is a very common feature of Mesoamerican architecture that seems to appear here first, and then by influence extends down into the Mayan sphere and other locations. And this is what we call the Talud and Tablero. So the Talud is the slanted part, and you can see that here, and the Tablero is this part. Now this is almost all rubble masonry. They would, some of this is ashlar masonry with very closely fitted, tightly fitted blocks like you see down in South America, but most of it's rubble masonry. And then it would be covered over in a thick layer of stucco that would then be painted. Some of this is fitted a little better than that. And this is interesting because this creates this series of tiers or layers. One of the prominent features that you'll notice is this thing right here. Let me erase some of the ink so you can see it, is that it has an overhang right here. And that overhang actually causes a shadow along the edge. Now, we believe that what this is meant to represent is a cloud. That when we look at some of the decorations of these tableros, that this zone here is often used for relief or decoration, and we see themes associated with clouds, water, rain, lightning, those kind of things. And that suggests that these are meant to be clouds, and that edge is meant to create the shadow of a cloud. So clouds, if you look up in the sky, they tend to be flatter on the bottom, they tend to have a shadow on the bottom. And so these are representing tiers of clouds. That makes sense that in the Mesoamerican worldview, there are many levels to the underworld and many levels to heaven above you and below you. And so this would represent tiers going up into heaven. That's tiers, T-I-E-R-S, not the other kind of tiers. And so you have levels leading up to heaven, and these all represent clouds. You can see that probably very, very clearly on the Temple of the Feathered Serpent. So this was that section that was excavated by Gamio and that he loved so much, and so he preserved it, removing the previous building. We have a massive central staircase, and it is flanked with the heads of plumed serpents or feathered serpents. And then on the surfaces here, you have these beautiful reliefs. So the construction of this was probably sometime around the year 300 CE or 300 Common Era. The later temple was probably built on top of that. The sculptured facade is from that time period, and there was probably another kind of level of decoration built on top of it. Here you can see in this wonderful reconstruction what this would have looked like. But remember that later, sometime after 300 CE, a huge platform was built out here, and then most of this would have been, covered up or destroyed. So it's kind of interesting. When we look at this temple, some interesting things that can be said about this temple is that there were discovered here 137 people buried. Gamio discovered these, and they apparently were sacrificial victims. They appeared to have their hands tied behind their backs, and many wore collars composed of imitation maxillae, that is the lower jaws of human beings. And the teeth were carved out of shell. But there were also plenty of real jawbones of human beings as well. And so there was over 2,000 pieces of worked shell, obsidian blades, and points. So clearly an incredible location that had a massive sacrifice that existed to dedicate it. The frieze itself is a wonderful frieze. So on the talud we have a serpent head. This is the plumed serpent. You can see the plume coming off of his head. You can see his sinuous body here. And in the spaces around the sinuous body you can see conch shells. Conch shells are always associated with rain, water, life, those kind of emblems. And then you can also see the tail end of the serpent here. And then you sometimes have the head of the plumed serpent, looking straight out. You can see serpent heads everywhere. These are really amazing. So Quetzalcoatl is generally a rain god, a god of rejuvenation, of rebirth, of corn and creation and many different things. We're not entirely certain what the people at Teotihuacan called him, so we generally just call this the Feathered Serpent, but it could have been Quetzalcoatl. The other figure that's here, alternating between the two, is probably the chief deity of Teotihuacan, and he too is a rain god and also kind of a war god, and he's always recognizable because he has this mosaic-like mask, and what this thing here represents is a headdress or a mask covered in turquoise or greenstone. And it has these two goggle-like eyes that are like probably jade discs that have been pierced like goggles. And these represent Tlaloc. Every time you see Tlaloc, he looks this way. So in the museum, there's a reconstruction of what this would have looked like. There are traces of color, and you can see that the serpent and his plumage would have been colored green. Tlaloc would have been colored a blue-green. And you have these incredible faces. So you can see Tlaloc everywhere in the iconography. He always has these goggle-like eyes, which probably represent jade discs. Here are these goggle-like eyes. He also has kind of prominent fangs. And so when we look at this mask here, it almost certainly represents Tlaloc. Here we can talk a little bit about Mesoamerican religion and duality. Mesoamerican gods are almost always paired in groups, or sometimes more. Gods are not simple in the Mesoamerican world. To be truthful, gods of the ancient world aren't that simple either. But, you were probably taught Greek mythology or Norse mythology, and that there's a god of thunder, that's Thor. There's a goddess of love and beauty, that's Venus, or you have Zeus, who's from thunder and lightning and a sky god. In reality, that's all kind of fake, too. Gods in the ancient world are far more complex and far more multivalent than we give them credit for. But we imagine gods as having certain roles or expressing certain attributes. But that's really not the way it works. Gods are multivalent, and they take on many roles, but no gods are more multivalent than the gods of the Mesoamerican world. Gods have all kinds of roles, and they can change. A god will have a different form, or even a different being, or a different name, depending on if that god is in the morning, the noon, or at sunset, or at night. There are 4 cardinal directions. Each cardinal direction in the Mesoamerican world is associated with a particular color. And then there's also up. So there's 5 different cardinal directions. Up, down, and then north, south, east, and west. I guess 6 total. But they usually personify this as 5. The vertical dimension and the other 4. And a god can have a different incarnation or avatar depending on if he is the god of the east or the god of the west that day, or the god of up or the god of down. And so you have gods like Quetzalcoatl and Tlaloc who are paired together as a kind of divine pair. And they're actually, in a weird kind of way, the same god. They are just the god in a different role or a different identity. You see this all the time. If you go to the Aztec pantheon, literally heaven, the name for heaven, is the place of two-ness, the place of duality. And you have Ometeotl, which is literally the dual god. That's what its name means. And he's kind of this overall creator god. But Quetzalcoatl can be paired with Tezcatlipoca and other gods in the Aztec pantheon. And the most prominent pairing in the Aztec pantheon is Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc. Tlaloc being a god obviously borrowed from these earlier traditions. But here it seems that they have paired Quetzalcoatl. That makes sense. So Tlaloc is a god of rain, but he's also a god of floods and drowning. And so he seems to be this negative aspect of water, this kind of destructive aspect of water, whereas Quetzalcoatl is the positive aspect of water, like rain and growth and etc. So this isn't terribly unusual. You will always see gods paired in this way, and they are different but also the same. It's very complex. So there was a recent excavation under this temple. A sinkhole opened up right in between this platform out in the courtyard and the actual proper temple that's there. It was a 3-foot sinkhole that opened up. Well, sinkholes don't happen unless there's some kind of cavity or cavern underneath that. And so Sergio Gomez in 2003 decided that he would go through the very difficult process of getting permission to dig into a cultural treasure. It's not easy. And he got permission to do it, and he discovered something truly amazing. He discovered that there was a passageway that led from this platform out in front of the complex. So this is the temple as restored by Gamio. It would have been probably larger than this. This is the platform in front, so this stairway you wouldn't have seen. This would have gone right to the edge. But this is where they made the discovery shaft, and they eventually discovered this tunnel that had been dug. And this tunnel went down into 2 layers and branched off into cruciform shapes. And they first started this, they actually had to get a robot. They got a robot from Mexico City, or the University of Mexico City, and to do this. But eventually they started excavating it by hand. And they found an amazing treasure trove of objects. Works in shell, obsidian, and greenstone. Huge deposits of votive figures and jawbones. There you can see more human jawbones and other features. These greenstone figures share some of the characteristics of Olmec figures, but Teotihuacan art is far more regimented, far more kind of structured and geometric. It isn't as organic or as naturalistic. So greenstone, again, is associated with life. We had little greenstone beads and necklaces of endless profusion. There was also things that appeared to carve channels into the floor, and there was evidence of mercury. So mercury was probably poured into rivulets on the floor when this was first created. You can only imagine what that is. Some people have suggested this was some kind of topography and the mercury represented water. I'm not so certain about that, but it certainly shows how significant this site was. And the lobed passage is significant in itself, that when we look at early histories or narratives about, say, the migrations of the Aztec and the Toltec, they talk about how they came from Chicomostoc. Chicomostoc is this legendary location where there was a cave, and the people lived in that cave, and all of the tribes came out of that cave, and one of those tribes was the Mexica, who would eventually become the founders of Tenochtitlan and the Aztec Empire. And so that cave is often shown as a lobed cave. So this is maybe an attempt to replicate that cave, to replicate the myth of the origin of these people. Now, under another one of these pyramids, there actually is a cave. There's a lobed cave, a natural cave. And so many people have suspected that that's why this place was so revered, is that the Mexica, the Aztec, regarded it as Chicomostoc, as the legendary cave from which their ancestors began their migrations before eventually coming to Tenochtitlan. So this is the Pyramid of the Sun, or at least this is the part that Batres restored back to. Again, some of these levels may not quite be accurate, and there's probably a bit more here that should have been. But still, it's incredibly massive. 61 meters tall, so a very, very large structure. In height, a little bit less than half of the height of, say, the pyramid at Giza, but it's much broader at the base, making it much more massive overall. It is the largest and oldest site on the Avenue of the Dead. There are potsherds and figurines in the fill at the very lowest levels that are from the late Formative period. So right when the Olmec were dying out, somebody was coming here and building something quite significant. And it was probably one of the tallest structures in North America until the 20th century. So it has this broad staircase that splits into 2 staircases that eventually fuse again, and there's probably temples and shrines at every level. It's made pretty haphazardly in its beginnings. They're actually, or what they do is they would make rubble walls to kind of partition off areas and then fill areas in with dirt or rubble. So while the exterior has got a masonry facade, it's mostly packed earth in there. And this was the location where there was a cave. Jorge Acosta was doing an installation of light and sound equipment for a show, because all of these archaeological sites now have shows, and he found a cave. And so the cave may, in fact, be the legendary cave of Chicomostoc, or the 7 caves. So it's also astronomically aligned. The pyramid faces the setting sun, and everything else in the entire city is laid out according to this orientation. So here you can see it. This is looking at the plaza as it comes off the Avenue of the Dead. Here are some of the outbuildings that surrounded it. And, of course, look at the people at it. You can give it a sense of the scale of it. It must have just been massive. Here's a reconstruction of it. And, of course, the reconstructions differ because, as you notice, this one has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 levels. And most of the reconstructions actually have 1, 2, 3, 4 in that same space. So, we're not entirely certain. It seems like most of the upper part here has been stripped off of the current building. But it would have just been absolutely gobsmacking. And it commands a plaza full of many smaller temples. There's another kind of sense of the reconstruction of what it looks like. I really do want to give you a number of reconstructions. You know, a lot of this is speculative, but they're pretty good. I found these beautiful reconstructions by a organization known as Molly Arts, and they actually had VR reconstructions that would allow you to stand at various locations and move around the space. Unfortunately, the website has gone down and it's no longer available, but it was really fun to walk around Teotihuacan. So from the top of the Pyramid of the Sun, looking out is towards the Pyramid of the Moon, which is on the other end of the Avenue of the Dead. Again, not really certain if this was the Pyramid of the Moon or not. Again, these are romantic names applied by archaeologists after the fact. It is constructed after the Pyramid of the Sun, and it uses a type of construction different from the kind of construction built at the Pyramid of the Sun, and so built after 300 CE. The core is made out of piers, built out of slabs, and then again it has infill with dirt until you fill out the basic shape. Still an impressive monument in its own right. And then we have what's known as the Viking group, this group of pyramids that surround the central plaza here. Here you can see this is a view looking down over the Avenue of the Dead from the top of the Pyramid of the Moon. And here's a hypothetical reconstruction. Under the front steps, there was an expansion made, and under that expansion was a tomb. And in that tomb we find a greenstone figure. So the tomb dates to somewhere around 150 CE. So it actually predates the final construction of the structure. And we have a couple of ear spools that are made out of metal, which is very rare. And so we have beautiful ear spools as well as a greenstone figure that again bears some resemblance to it. There were other excavations. We expect this may have been the burial of a royal retainer or a king. The problem is it's very difficult to excavate into a pyramid that's mostly made of packed earth because cave-ins are very, very easy. But a few things, such as this greenstone figure, this one comes from the 5th phase, and this is a later period, and we see this squatting figure, well, not squatting, seated with folding legs. Again, greenstone beads. The Avenue Dead for itself runs north-south, and it's complemented by the second access that runs east and west. It's 130 feet wide and about 1.5 miles long, so a massive ceremonial center. But it does change elevation throughout the building. There are breaks, so you'll notice that there are stairways that break the main plaza down in before you actually get back to the Citadel. And there's at least 2 earlier layers underneath this. So this plaza isn't even the first construction at the site. It's probably the 3rd and maybe the 4th or the 5th. Now, outside of the Avenue of the Dead and these major temple complexes, there are a number of smaller temples, most of which have never been excavated or reconstructed, but there are also palaces and residences. These palaces are built around open courtyards, and the courtyards have basalt columns, and on these are beautiful reliefs. So this is a reconstruction of one. So you would have a large open-air patio, and then facing off of this, there would be kind of pavilions. These pavilions kind of have porches and then interior spaces. But there were also many other interior courtyards. So this probably would have been a self-contained, unit for a family and nobles, so his expanded family, and probably served as a sanctuary or shrine site as well. So there's very little access and entry here. You can notice there's really the main entrance and then a few side entrances. They're really built like forts inside the city. So you have multiple of these kind of completely self-contained little palaces or villas. Again, they have beautiful columns. These columns are assembled out of basalt, and these would have been covered in a thin layer of stucco and painted. They show representations of gods and other figures. The other feature of these is that they are covered in frescoes. The main courtyard has these basalt columns, but the interior buildings have frescoes, and the frescoes have been preserved. They're just gorgeous. So these things would have just been absolutely alive, filled with color, covered in frescoes, an open courtyard where you would have done business or greeted guests, and then covered porticos. Mexico could be very hot, so you have a place to get out of the shade but still have plenty of open air. The Palace of Tepantitla is one of the more remarkable of these, and we assume that most of these palaces served noble families, but noble families also served as priests and priestesses to the various cults that existed at the site. So there really isn't a difference between church and state. So you have kind of ruling nobles that probably had control over this. So when you look into the palaces, you see a lot of religious imagery as well. In the frescoes, we can see figures. This one is wearing a ceremonial headdress, and the ceremonial headdress is faded but has green feathers. These are Quetzal feathers. This is where we get the name Quetzal. And the Quetzal bird is, of course, native to Guatemala and southern Mexico, so these would have had to be imported miles to get here, hundreds and hundreds of miles to get here. But look at how many feathers. Each one of these Quetzal birds only has about 2 feathers like that length. So and just do the counting. 1, 2, that's 1 dead bird. 1, 2, that's 2 dead birds. And it goes on. So the Quetzal feathers, again, are associated with the feathered serpent. When you look at the headdress, it looks very much like this feathered serpent. The figure here who wears this holds a situla, a bucket. And the ceremonial bucket, he dips his hand into it and appears to be spreading water. And so we see 2 iterations of water. You see water gushing from his hand, but you also see clouds. And coming out of the cloud is this form, and you can see flowers blossoming. Now, that's, of course, because water is the source of life, so the flowers blossoming, indicating that the moisture is life. And if you look in this, you have, it's very faded, you have images of shells, but you also have images of celts. Remember celts? Celts are those things we talked about in the Olmec period, that these greenstone objects. These are ceremonial axe heads. Greenstone is associated with life, with water, etc. So you actually see greenstone objects in the cloud, indicating that this is life. So life is, he's spreading life, and it's flowing from his hands. One of the more beautiful scenes is this one, the water goddess. This is a reconstruction, but it's a pretty good reconstruction. This is known as the water goddess or the spider woman. She's so named the spider woman because everywhere there are spiders. So see the spider here? There are also spiders here. And the spiders are painted green, as if they are made out of greenstone. So we have a woman here in an elaborate headdress. Look at all these feathers. And then this covers her face entirely. And then she sticks her hands out. And then water is dripping from her hands, but it almost is like dripping jade. And then you have, again, clouds and issuings of water coming forth, and waves and water representing life created. And from her grow flowers, and into the flowers grow all of these jade objects that probably indicate life. We have butterflies and spiders, and these terminate in flowers, and then we have birds. And I love, the birds are tweeting and singing. They have a cloud coming out of their mouth, indicating they are singing. So anytime you see these are like birds tweeting or singing. Likewise, here are 2 priests who bless this with water, and flowing out of their hands are rivers of water budding out in flowers. Notice that here we have one of those Celts. It's got a cleft head, so this is again that jaguar imagery. Celts and jade flowing out into clouds. All of this indicating the wealth of water and the life given by the gods. There's some mystifying scenes here. Some have identified this as the paradise of Tlaloc. So notice what we've got going on here. So first of all, we have a mountain-like form that is in fact open water, and you can see people are flowing down into it. Notice this. Remember the sky banding from the Olmec? There it is again, representing the distinction of the sky. And into this we have people being plunged into water. Now what's interesting is that in the Mesoamerican world, if you go to Mictlan, that's the world of the dead, everybody has to go through Mictlan, and nobody manages to get to a positive or happy afterlife without going through Mictlan, and most people just wind up in Mictlan. There's a few exceptions, of course. If you are a woman that dies in childbirth, you go straight to heaven, which is interesting. Then you turn into these strange demon-like women that are terrifying. But hey, it's better than getting sent to the underworld. If you're a warrior or a king and you die in battle, then that's the way to go. But one of the interesting things is if you die by drowning. You get a straight ticket to heaven. Remember, Tlaloc is the god of rain and floods. So if you die by drowning, it's believed that you are being taken by Tlaloc. So this thing has been tentatively identified as the paradise of Tlaloc. You can see people are essentially being taken in the water, they're being drowned, but they're being clutched at and pulled out of the water as they are kind of flailing. And then over here we see people engaged in dancing. Notice that they're singing because we have little clouds coming out of their mouths. They're also engaged in dancing and playing and acrobatics and harvesting. This seems to be a pretty happy existence. And so the interpretation is this is the paradise that awaits those who have been taken by drowning. That is, suggests that they are become sacrificial victims to Tlaloc. This one is often identified as a water goddess. This is a sculpture that was found near the so-called Pyramid of the Moon, and no one's quite certain how to identify this. The thinking this is Chalchue-Tlique. Chalchue-Tlique is the water goddess in the Aztec tradition and the Toltec tradition. She bears many of the same features, but she has a mantle, for example, and an elaborate headdress. There's something about her decoration that seems to indicate water, but it's tentative at best. The most I want to talk about this figure is that it shows how different Teotihuacan art is, how much more structural, geometric, regimented it is. The sculptures are far stiffer. They don't look like the Olmec or even the Zapotec lively dancing figures that we see. And that's going to be a trend that holds true throughout the Mesoamerican sphere. That Mesoamerican art in the Mexican basin is going to be much more carefully designed. It's going to be, I mean, look at this, the design, the symmetry of this is beautiful, but it's very rigid, very geometric, doesn't have a lot of organic or naturalism. But the art of the Maya and of the Olmec is going to be much more organic, much more naturalistic. It's going to pay much more attention to details and to be more curvilinear. It isn't going to have this incredible structured design. When we get to the Toltec and the Aztecs are just masters of design. Perfectly compact sculptures that are just beautifully executed, but not especially naturalistic. Beautiful, terrifying at times, beautifully designed, but not naturalistic. They care more about the impact of the design and the iconography and getting the message of the figure across. Whereas in the Mayan zone, you're going to see some really beautifully naturalistic figures as well. I've already mentioned it, but some of the characteristic objects that are just identified with Teotihuacan are going to be these beautiful tripod vessels. We find them incised, but we also find them with polychrome coating. So these are ceramic vessels that are coated in a thin layer of stucco or plaster and then painted almost like you would paint a fresco. These show representations of gods. This is probably a representation of Tlaloc, but we're not entirely certain. We also find stone funerary masks, which are very similar to what we see in the Olmec zone, except again, they're more abstract, they're more regimented. We see them in hard stones and green stones. Again, these are not usually life-size masks, and they're not meant to cover the face. They're usually placed on the breast. Some of them are big enough to be placed over the face. And again, this has to do with the stone represents life, and so if the person is deceased, you give them a face that will not rot. You give them kind of adamantine flesh that is permanent to carry them into the afterlife. Sometimes these stone masks are beautifully decorated with mosaics. So here we have a stone mask that is decorated in a mixture of coral and turquoise, creating this just really beautiful and incredible lively face. And so that will close us out on Teotihuacan. So we'll stop on Teotihuacan there. And when we come back next week, we will pick up with the early classic Maya. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.